Are you part of the great resignation, that mass exodus of people who are leaving their jobs to start something new? Then something you need to consider is what to do with your company 401k. Rather than just rolling it over, consider opening a truly self-directed IRA. With a self-directed IRA, a truly self-directed IRA, your retirement portfolio can include real estate, precious metals, cryptocurrency, notes, loans, a new business, and traditional equities like stocks and bonds. You can make any investment the law allows with a truly self-directed retirement account. Listen, you probably have questions, so why not take the time to get the answers? Start with going to IRAadvantage.com. Then talk to the truly self-directed IRA professionals at IRA Advantage.
Would you like to learn more about truly self-directed IRAs? Then visit IRAadvantage.com, view our videos, and call IRA Advantage. Let us set up a truly self-directed IRA for you. That's IRAadvantage.com.
You're listening to the best of the Lars Larson Show.
Welcome back to the Lars Larson Show. I suppose I always disclose if I have a dog in the fight, a bias in a particular thing. I suppose one of these days I might be on Medicare. I'm nowhere near Medicare right now. But when I hear that Medicare's older rules may actually be causing people to end up with strokes, I thought we've got to dig into this and find out what's going on. Bill Stotts is the president of the Mary Hess Foundation. Mr. Stotts, welcome to the program.
Oh, it's great to be here, Lars. Thank you so much for having me on the air. This is an incredible opportunity, and it's appreciated.
Well, I want you to tell people about this. First of all, the Mary Hess Foundation, what is its cause?
Our cause is, our mission is really to help our senior citizens and other stroke survivors with the therapy costs after things like the Medicare 100-day benefit period expire. And I'm very happy that you touched on that because that's exactly what's been happening since the 1960s. This policy excludes treatments after 100 days, and it doesn't matter what the benefits are. And you can get another 100 days after 60 days, but they can't be related to the first event. So if you had a stroke and you get a second 100 days, you can't use therapy for that stroke. And this process has really allowed people to die needlessly just because they're senior citizens, they're not contributors to the tax base, and it's just a senseless policy to have. I actually wrote a bill that Congressman Steve Cohen refused. Well, he had it for 29 months, changing that 100-day benefit period to a sliding scale. And also making doctors visit nonverbal residents and nursing homes once a week instead of every 60 days, like their minimal requirements are. And Mr. Cohen had that bill for 29 months. I got emails saying it was presented to the 113th Congress, who they were working with, all this stuff that was going on. And then in the end told me it had never been drafted. So,
okay, but Bill, tell me this. Was there some logic to putting a 100-day limit on initially? Because I know Congress sometimes they'll write things based on science, they'll write it on the law, they'll write it with some kind of logical basis. Was there ever a logical basis to say stroke survivors on Medicare, after 100 days, your benefit just expires as though you don't need the benefit anymore? Was there some logic to any of it?
Right. And keep in mind, too, that 100-day benefit period is not limited to stroke survivors. That's anything that you have. If you're a Medicare patient, you only get 100 days of treatment for that. And the answer to your question is there's some illogic to it, but nothing logical. The only thing I can find is cost. It's a lot cheaper to not treat somebody and let them just wither away and die than it is to try to make them make a recovery. And
well, but it almost seems bizarre because if you're doing this just based on cost and saying, okay, we're going to give you 100 days of benefits, and then at that point, you're done. So they assume that you're either a whole lot better than you were at the beginning or you're dead, because otherwise giving you benefits for 100 days and then saying, and then they cut off, which I assume puts you in a kind of situation that may be likely to bring about your demise, seems counterintuitive because then why spend the money to give somebody, help for 100 days and then cut it off at a point where they may need it for another short time or maybe even another long time? It doesn't sound like it's hooked to medicine or science at all.
It's not. And this is my mother's story. This is why I started the foundation. On her 23rd day, she was transferred to a facility where we thought she was going to be able to get really good physical therapy. On her 100th day, with really just 50 days of therapy, because she spent some time in isolation with an infection, she was actually standing, weight bearing on both feet with assistance. The neurologists all told us she could make an astonishing recovery, but Medicare didn't care about that. It was the 100 days is over. There's nothing else you can do. And they put her back in her bed, and a year later she was gone. And there was absolutely no justification, no sense in letting any individual, not just my mother, anybody, get to the point where they're making such a phenomenal recovery and then just throwing your hands up and saying, okay, we're not going to pay anymore. And that's exactly what you pointed out a minute ago, is you're just letting them get to that, the 100 days, and then it's just over with. And there's no sense in that.
Well, no, because then all the resources you've spent in the first 100 days that might have been about to produce an actual result, a positive result for that American, is simply cut off. So in effect, if you've just terminated them and you've perhaps put them on a path to ending up dying of this, then you didn't accomplish anything with the 100 days of resources you spent. It sounds like it could be wasteful a couple of different ways. Again, I'm not trying to treat your mom like a widget, but if you say we're going to put this much work into it, but when we get right there, we might be 10 days or 20 days or 30 days away from real success for this person. Nope, cut it off and let the chips fall where they may, is what it sounds like.
That's exactly right. And that's why I started this foundation, because I want to help. I want this foundation, and this is our purpose, our mission, and our goal, to be able to help individuals maximize their recovery after the benefit period with Medicare or whatever insurance policies they have expire. Any other benefits expire, we'd like to be able to help them as much as possible to maximize their recovery. And that's something that's long overdue, and it was a recognized need with my mother. And it took me 5 years to get to the point where I am today with this, and it's just been on the ground since October of last year. And it's a slow start, I have to be honest, but I think it's a worthy cause, and we're going to make it work.
It sounds like it. Bill, I know people are going to want to hook up to that. Where can they go on social media to find out more and maybe to join your effort?
They can go to HessStrokeFoundation.org and make a donation, read my mother's story, tour the webpage. We have a Facebook account, Miriam Hess Foundation. They can search Facebook and find that.
Yep. And
make a donation through there. I've got ads running, and we're just happy to have the opportunity to be here. And we've actually got an event coming up June 3rd here in Memphis at a local restaurant, an auction. A couple of speakers. I think you may have heard of Frederick Tappan. He's a talk show host on KWAM here in Memphis, and then another speaker, Charlotte Bergman.
I want people to know about it so they can join you, because this is where government makes absolutely no sense at all. To write a set of criteria like 100 days, saying, well, maybe you only needed 90 days, maybe you needed 115, but we're cutting you off at 100, even if we might have actually done some work, some good for a real human being. That's William Stotts, the president of the Mary Hess Foundation. Mr. Stotts, I appreciate your time, and we'll make sure that all those connections on our website, so when people want to find out more about it, they can do it very easily. Thank you for the time. Glad to get your phone calls at 866-439-5277. Send your emails to talk@LarsLarson.com. Vote in our Twitter poll @Lars Larson Show. And be sure to tell Alexa, if you trust her, play The Lars Larson Show. Are you part of the Great Resignation, that mass exodus of people who are leaving their jobs to start something new? Then something you need to consider is what to do with your company 401k. Rather than just rolling it over, consider opening a truly self-directed IRA. With a self-directed IRA, a truly self-directed IRA, your retirement portfolio can include real estate, precious metals, cryptocurrency, notes, loans, a new business, and traditional equities like stocks and bonds. You can make any investment the law allows with a truly self-directed retirement account. Listen, you probably have questions, so why not take the time to get the answers? Start with going to IRAadvantage.com, then talk to the truly self-directed IRA professionals at IRA Advantage.
Would you like to learn more about truly self-directed IRAs? Then visit IRAadvantage.com, view our videos, and call IRA Advantage. Let us set up a truly self-directed IRA for you. That's IRAadvantage.com.
Welcome back to the Lars Larson Show. It's a pleasure to be with you. I want you to consider that just like his stance on Israel and Taiwan, Joe Biden loves to say one thing, only to have his administration, everybody else that works for him, walk it back. But have all those walkbacks and apologies caused Americans to lose faith in Joe Biden's foreign policy? That is, I guess, of course, considering whether they had faith in it to begin with or not, given that even some of his associates from the Obama years said Joe Biden has got every single position he's ever taken on foreign policy wrong. I thought I'd talk about that with Annelle Sheline, who is with the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. Ms. Sheline, welcome to the program.
Thank you for having me.
So are these walkbacks costing the White House any kind of credibility it ever had?
Well, what's been interesting, at least what I've been working on, is the pressure the White House put on Bernie Sanders to withdraw his Yemen War Powers Resolution. That vote was supposed to come to the floor on Tuesday, and at the last minute, Sanders said he'd gotten an assurance from the White House that they were going to work on something mutually agreeable so that the U.S. would stop supporting Saudi Arabia in this war. Part of what's surprising about this is after we saw Saudi Arabia cut oil production by 2 million barrels per day in October, Biden said he wanted to rethink the U.S.-Saudi relationship, and he wanted Congress to take the lead. And so this would have been Congress taking the lead. This would have been a war powers resolution to reassert congressional war-making authority. And the Biden administration issued a pretty strong statements against it, reached out to Congress, reached out both publicly and privately to say they were opposed. And so Sanders ended up temporarily withdrawing. He said he'll reintroduce it later, but, it's going to be under the new Congress and it's going to be more difficult.
I want to ask you this, though. Administrations, they have a certain amount of information they've got to hold back about where they're going. I wouldn't expect them to tell the rest of the world where we're headed. But if you don't communicate some kind of message, overall message, this is the direction our administration is going, don't you run the risk that nobody trusts you if they don't have any idea what you plan to do, and if you're constantly making changes in course that nobody anticipates?
Definitely. I mean, I think we've seen the Biden administration stick to a pretty typical playbook, just as far as the efforts to, again, try to project American power abroad. We've seen them just continuing to maintain a lot of this really aggressive rhetoric towards China, something that the Trump administration started, which personally I just don't think is helpful. We really need to find ways to partner with China on important issues like pandemics and economic development, and especially on climate change. So I don't really see really that much of a difference from administration to administration. A lot of it is just sort of this notion that American primacy is the way to go, or that we're seeing one of the largest military budgets we've ever seen since some of the record-breaking budgets that were necessarily in place during times like World War II, for example. But the U.S. is not currently fighting any major wars abroad. Obviously involved in supporting.
Well, we're sending a lot of hardware to Ukraine, aren't we?
We certainly are, but we're not fighting a war the way we were in Iraq or Afghanistan, and yet still we're getting massive Pentagon budgets, even above what Biden himself requested. Congress has now approved even more money, and more than half of that is going to go to private contractors and not even to the service members themselves. A report just came out that actually many military families struggle to even put food on the table, and so even though we have these massive bloated Pentagon budgets, not actually going to support our service members. Most of it is going to massive military companies like Raytheon, Lockheed Martin, Boeing, the other big five weapons contractors. who price gouge and charge far beyond what many of their services are actually worth. But they've created a monopoly and they're able to charge what they want, and the Pentagon just keeps going along with it.
See, I'm kind of curious about that, though, because you've had Iraq, you've had Afghanistan, and my understanding is we've diminished an awful lot of the hardware and the equipment that we have by those actions. We left billions of dollars worth of gear behind in Afghanistan. That had to hurt. Now we're sending a lot of hardware, a lot of money as well to Ukraine. That you've got to replenish all those stores, don't you, if America is going to be prepared for whatever might come, which could be a conflict with China over Taiwan. Shouldn't we have to spend a lot of money with private contractors because they're the ones who build the bombs and the bullets?
No, I mean, I really disagree. And if people are interested, I would direct them towards my colleague, Bill Hartung's work, who's much more of an expert on this. My focus is the Middle East, whereas Bill can get into much more on the sort of broader question of military spending and China and Ukraine. So recommend you speak with him, Lars, next time.
Okay, I'm glad to do that. But Anel, let me ask you then about the Middle East. I don't even get a sense of a coherent policy there. Biden comes in after Trump. Trump had the Abraham Accords, which had the promise, we were told in the fall of 20, in the 2020 election year, we had the promise of 4 or 5 more deals in the Middle East that might have brought, some additional movement forward on things that had moved in many ways in decades, and that appears to be out the door or kicked to the curb. What is the Middle East policy of the Joe Biden administration?
I mean, like I was saying, it is kind of a continuity of many of his predecessors, essentially prioritizing relationships such as with Saudi Arabia, even though, as you said, Biden has really switched on that. He was on the campaign trail really saying things like we need to treat the Mohammed bin Salman, the crown prince, responsible for the
prize that they
murder
are.
of Khashoggi. Exactly, the prize that they are. And then instead we see him traveling to Saudi Arabia over the summer, that infamous fist bump. And it didn't pay off at all. As I mentioned, the OPEC Plus cuts, which reflect, Saudi and Russian efforts to keep the price of oil high, which is hurting, efforts to sanction Russia over what Russia is doing to Ukraine. I think many of these countries that we consider partners in the Middle East, whether it's the Saudis or the Israelis or the Emiratis, I mean, they see the way the wind is blowing. They see that now we're in a multipolar world where the U.S. is no longer the hegemonic force that it once was. And they're hedging, so they're building relationships with China. We just saw President Xi spend several days in Saudi Arabia. China is Saudi Arabia's most important customer, the biggest consumer of Saudi oil and gas. And China is a massive consumer for other Middle Eastern partners as well. So unfortunately, the U.S. has sort of ceded much of the economic ground to China, and instead we just try to maintain this relationship on the basis of weapons sales. But then as far as that goes, we're sort of dependent on these countries now because, again, our whole political process is so in the thrall of these massive weapons producers that the thought that we might lose one of our most important customers, the Saudis, remain our most important customer of big weapons purchases, means that our policymaking is completely captured by them and their interests, such that, again, to go back to the war in Yemen, we continue to support what Saudi Arabia is doing to Yemen, which is in many ways quite similar to what Russia is doing to Ukraine, this devastating war on civilians in the territory of their, weak and impoverished neighbor, with horrific effects on the innocent people living there. So on the one hand, the U.S. is helping Ukraine, but we're doing the exact opposite by helping the Saudis with what they're doing to Yemen.
Well, Anel, I got to tell you this. I always tell my audience, I'm trying to be as charitable as I can to the Biden administration. If they didn't have double standards, they'd probably have no standards at all. So I guess we have to just assume they're going to do things that are, contradictory. They're going to do things that don't make any sense from the outside or even from the inside. And I guess that's just what we got with allegedly 81 million votes. That's Anel Sheline, who is with the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. Ms. Sheline, thanks very much. I appreciate the time. Coming up in a moment, A former U.S. Marine pilot, Daniel Edmund Duggan, allegedly tried to acquire carrier jets for China, and he's now been arrested in Australia. I'll tell you about the story, and we'll give full and lavish credit to the folks behind the story. This is crazy. A former United States Marine Corps officer who's now trying to help China put airplanes on the decks of its aircraft carriers. You've got the Lars Larson Show. Welcome back to the Lars Larson Show. It's a pleasure to be with you. And one of the stunning things for me as a news guy, I've been a news guy for about 47 years as of this year, is to see a major league story involving some of the most famous names in America: Donald Trump, Hillary Clinton, Democrat National Party, and a new development happened over the weekend. And some legal papers were filed in aid of a kind of a routine matter involving conflicts of interest. They were filed by special counsel John Durham. And in that filing, he says, we have the information. This is the guy who was assigned to investigate the origins of the Russia hoax that Hillary Clinton tried to use to get elected. And you say, we know that, Lars. The DNC and Hillary paid for it. It was Perkins Coie, the law firm. It was Fusion GPS. Here's what you might not have known. There is a figure within those documents called Technology Executive One, who, not surprisingly, works for Technology Company One, that managed to surveil Donald Trump's computers. And you say, well, what's the big deal? Donald Trump's a private citizen. Yeah, probably looking at his computers or surveilling them in one way or another. That's technically a violation of federal law, but no big deal. Except he didn't just surveil Donald Trump candidates' computers. He surveilled Donald Trump, the president's computers at the White House, according to these filings from John Durham. I thought we'd get Hans von Spakowski on, who's senior legal fellow at the Heritage Foundation. Hans, welcome back.
Thanks for having me back.
If in anything I just said you think I'm seriously off base, please feel free to correct me. This seems like a fairly significant thing that John Durham knew when he filed this routine little document saying there might be a conflict of interest having the same law firm that represents the DNC and other people there representing a lawyer who's been accused of lying to the FBI about some of the things involved in this. And he drops in this little factoid that, tech company number one and tech executive number one, who we believe is Rodney Jaffe, was actually accessing internet data not only for Trump Tower, but for the White House as well. And most of the media this weekend, I just checked CNN, MSNBC, New York Times, Washington Post, no stories, not any reaction at all to a large degree.
Yeah, I am just shocked. I'm shocked at that because, look, we're not just talking about seeing what folks are doing on the internet. We're talking about access to non-public and proprietary internet data. In other words, they were engaging in electronic espionage, and they were collecting the internet traffic from the Trump Tower, from Trump's apartment in New York, and then when he moved into the White House, it turned out this company had a service contract with the executive office of the president to provide certain maintenance feature for their computer servers. That's all. They used that to also go into the White House computer system, again, to engage in electronic espionage and to mine the data looking for information and documents derogatory to Donald Trump. And for those folks who think this isn't a big deal, this is a criminal violation of federal law, the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, and you can get up to 10 years in prison for doing something like this.
Well, and the other piece about it is, and let me ask you this question. I don't know that much about computers. I know how to use the computers in front of me. But a member of Congress this weekend made the point, this didn't happen without somebody on the inside being able to tell that it was happening. In other words, could you imagine a private company saying, we can harvest internet data involving internet connections between the White House and everywhere Donald Trump might communicate from the White House, and we can do it without anybody in the federal government being aware of it? Does that seem likely?
Well, I could see that happening, particularly because one of the things they talk about in here is that one of the ways he did this was that he got a university involved, and the researchers at a university who had, if you can believe this, a pending government contract to do cybersecurity work for the government. So
and by the way, tech company number one, according to Durham's previous filings, said, hey, when Hillary becomes president, we're expecting some major contracts from her. Of course, if Hillary doesn't become president, we're not going to get the big contracts. So there's a financial motivation to try to gimmick the communications of the president of the United States.
Well, yeah, it was. Now, for those who say this isn't serious, I would make 2 points. One, if a foreign spy agency had done this, they would be criminally prosecuted for espionage, okay? And it's not somehow okay when we have a political campaign, the Clinton campaign, actually paying this high-tech entrepreneur and his internet company to engage in electronic spying, not just on the opposing candidate, which is how it started, but then actually on the president when he is in the White House. And second, a lot of people are saying, comparing this to and saying it's the high-tech Watergate.
Yeah.
I think you could argue that this is worse than Watergate. Why? Because the Nixon reelection campaign burglars who broke into the DNC headquarters, yeah, they got caught. They were caught. They got in there because they wanted to wiretap the phones and gather documents. They got caught before any of that could happen. These guys were successful. They engaged in a high-tech burglary. They were able to gather voluminous amounts of data and private communications, potentially classified communications in the White House, and they got away with it. I think that potentially makes it a lot worse than Watergate, which led to the downfall of a president.
Well, see, I pointed that out today. I mean, I said this is like Watergate on steroids. But then on top of that, they took what they found and went through a cutout, allegedly, Michael Sussman, the attorney with Perkins Coie, and took it to the FBI, to the chief counsel, the top lawyer at the FBI, and said, hey, we've got this information. And nobody at the FBI twigged to the idea that, hey, where'd they get this information on a candidate and perhaps on a president as well, and went after it. And there's a suspicion that that's because the FBI was kind of in the bag under James Comey. Now, I know that's a little far out there, but Hans, you tell me what you think.
Well, you have to figure that the government is either highly incompetent when it comes to cybersecurity because nobody figured this out, or somebody knew and just ignored it. And by the Clinton campaign's high-tech allies and by the Clinton campaign to engineer a phony law enforcement investigation.
That's Hans von Spakowski, who's a senior legal fellow at the Heritage Foundation. Hans, thank you very much for the time. We always appreciate it. Got a little heads up for my listeners. An incredible app that everybody who buys gasoline, that includes me, needs to know about. It's called Get Upside. My listeners are getting 25 cents cash back for every gallon of gas they buy every time they fill up. Just download the free Get Upside app in the App Store or Google Play and do it right now. Use promo code Lars, and on the first fill up you do, an extra 25 cents per gallon. Don't pay full price at the pump anymore. Get your cash back every time you tank up using Get Upside. Download the app for free. Use my name on the first tank up, 25 cents per gallon on top. After that, 25 cents per gallon on every gallon you buy. Some people who drive a lot, you might get back $200 or $300 a year in cash back right now. And it's fantastic. The cash back gets added right to your account. You can cash out anytime to your bank account, PayPal, e-gift card, Amazon, all the rest. Just download the free Get Upside app. Use promo code Lars, L-A-R-S, to get 25 cents per gallon or more cash back on your first tank. That's code word Lars and Get Upside. We'll be back in a moment. 866-HEY-LARS. You're listening to the Lars Larson Show.
I'm not going to accept any work requirements that's going to impact on medical health needs of people.
Now, that is Joe Biden. And yes, he is the president of the United States, and he's dead wrong on this issue. And it's one of the reasons that Joe Biden has driven this country to the edge of defaulting on its debt. Welcome back to the Lars Larson Show. It's a pleasure to be with you. I want to tell you something about one particular issue on which Joe Biden says he will not budge. And I think you'll find it as unreasonable as I do. But first, welcome to the Lars Larson Show. If you want to join the best conversation in talk journalism, it's right here every day at 866-HEY-LARS. That's 866-439-5277. Send your emails to talk@larslarson.com. And, of course, you can vote in our Twitter poll. We put up a brand new question each and every day from the news of the day, just to see what's on your mind and see how people go on various issues. But what Joe Biden said there, he is not going to even consider any kind of work requirement for Medicaid. Now, this takes some explanation, and let me tell you why. Number one, I know that most of you who listen to this show are not on Medicaid. Whatever they call it in your state, you're not on Medicaid. Medicaid is for people, poor people, who are in poverty, although now they've expanded the definitions and the income requirements so that a gigantic number of Americans are dependent on this program. In fact, I was watching some old videos this morning in preparation for the show. I wanted to find Reagan's statement, and I can't find it on video, where he literally said, the best social program in the world is a job. And he said, other than that, you end up with people dependent on the government. And he bragged about the fact that when he was president, this was in 87 that he made this comment, he said, we've reduced the number of people on the welfare rolls. We've reduced the number of people getting aid to families with dependent children, which I believe is now called TANF. They always change the names of these programs. Once it was welfare, then it was the dole, then it was something else. And every time those names of programs take on a undesirable taint, let's say, they change the name to something else. But Reagan was right. The best social program in the world is a job. So if you say, well, Lars, what are you going to do for poor people in America? I say, okay, we have a program in the government that will supply them with health insurance. Health insurance so that they can go and get medical care, although there are some great studies, even from my neck of the woods, that show that putting people on Medicaid doesn't necessarily improve their health. I know that sounds counterintuitive. You say, well, Lars, if you have a plan where when you start to feel sick, you can go see the doctor, you can get a prescription, you can get things taken care of course that's going to improve somebody's health. They did a gigantic study. They studied 60,000 people. 30,000 of them were on Medicaid. 30,000 were not. And they made it fair because what had happened was there'd been a time where new entries to Medicaid were frozen. And when they unfroze them, they said, we don't have enough slots for everybody. We've only got room for 30,000 people to add. Harvard did the study. And here's what they did. So the groups were both qualified to be on Medicaid income-wise, but they handed out the Medicaid assignments based on a lottery. So it was purely random. They then looked at those people over the course of the next couple of years and said, we've got a group, both groups, 30,000 each, are qualified for Medicaid. But only 30,000 of them will get it. The other 30,000 will not. It's like a perfect scientific study. You've got the test group and you've got the control group. Guess what they found at the end of a couple of years? They said didn't seem to make any difference in their health outcomes at all. You say, well, that doesn't make sense. Yeah, it does. If you think about an awful lot of people are poor because they don't work. And even in these economic times, America has literally millions of jobs that are available. So you've got people who choose not to work. They are therefore poor. They then qualify for Medicaid. Do you think that the kind of people who wouldn't get up off their duff and go get one of the millions of jobs that are available are the ones who will say, well, I better be proactive about my medical care? But here's where it gets worse. Number one, Joe Biden has spent the last 104 days until late last week saying, I will not negotiate with the Republicans on the debt ceiling. Now, this is crazy for one reason, because Joe Biden, when he was a senator and when he was a vice president, he would tell reporters all the time, when it comes to the debt ceiling, you have to negotiate. Now, all of a sudden that he's president, he's decided he feels 180 degrees the other way. But here's where it gets even more ironic. With regard to work requirements for Medicaid, here's all the government says in the law. If you're on Medicaid, we expect you to either hold down a 20 hours a week job or be looking for a job or be in a training program so someday you can get a job and become independent of this government program. That's all they're asking. Half-time work, 20 hours a week, or out looking for a job or training for a job. Now, you tell me, would any naysayer caller tell me, well, that's an unreasonable thing to ask of an unemployed person in poverty who's asking for free medical care, free meaning paid for by your fellow Americans' taxes? I don't find it unreasonable. Somebody was going to give me something that for, say, a family of 3 or family of 4 is worth over $1,000 a month. And all I've got to do is either look for a job, train for a job, or actually hold a job. And you only have to hold a half-time job, 20 hours a week. That's not much. Joe Biden won't budge on this. And why should you give a damn about that? Here's why. If they put the work requirements in, they're already in the law. But if you told the states you've got to enforce the work requirements, you want to be on Medicaid, look for a job, keep a job, get in training for a job, learn how to weld or do accounting or whatever. But you've got to be on your way to a job if you want this program where your fellow taxpayers pay for it. That would save, according to the calculations, $109 billion over the next 10 years. $109 billion would be saved just by saying there's a work requirement. And if you don't want to fill the work requirement, you aren't going to get Medicaid. Now, do you know which elected official has voted for that policy in the law? Well, that would be Senator Joe Biden, who voted for work requirements in Medicaid. And now that he's president, he says, I won't even consider work requirements for Medicaid. And then you tell me, ask any of your friends, you think people should get free health insurance from the government worth a lot of money every month? For a big enough family, it might be worth a couple of $1,000 a month, and that we shouldn't ask them to hold down a half-time job to qualify, or at least be on a path to a job. You see how many of your friends would say, hey, they're not willing to work. I don't want them to get anything for free. And I would be in that club as well. And the crazy thing is, if somebody gets a part-time job, a 20 hours a week job, how many of you who are successful today got to the full-time job with good benefits and everything else by starting with a part-time job? I did. I had tons of part-time jobs. I worked sometimes 4 part-time jobs at a time to make ends meet. And you say, well, hold on. Why would you hold down 4 part-time jobs? I said, because that's what it took to pay the bills. You're listening to The Lars Larson Show.
You're listening to the best of the Lars Larson Show.
Welcome back to the Lars Larson Show. It's a pleasure to be with you, and I'm always glad to take your phone calls and emails. I tell you, I've got a dog in the fight because my mom and dad were both in the U.S. Navy, dad for 21, mom for 5, 1940 through 45. So I especially appreciate people like Gary Sinise. You know Gary from the movie business, but you also should know him from the Lieutenant Dan Band, which is going to be performing at Constitution Hall in Washington, D.C. on the 26th of May in honor of America's veterans and in honor of, there are actually 2 very important anniversaries from 50 years ago, aren't there, Mr. Sinise?
Well, we have. Well, thanks for having me, Lars. Good to be with you. Yes, well, this year is the end of the 50th anniversary, the end of combat operations in Vietnam, and the return of our POWs. We're going to feature several POWs on the National Memorial Day concert on PBS on May 28th. I wanted to do a little something special for our Vietnam veterans, a little something extra, And so on May 26th at Constitution Hall, we have a free concert celebrating our Vietnam veterans, a big welcome home celebration. They didn't get the welcome home they deserved all those years ago, so we're going to play a concert and salute and honor our Vietnam veterans on May 26th. You can go to GarySiniseFoundation.org to get tickets. It's free.
And we want to see that happen. The other anniversary I was referring to is some young guy got into the movie business 50 years ago, didn't he?
Oh, gee. 50 years ago?
Was it 73?
No, not 50. Let's see. When was it? Back in the 90s, I think.
Okay, I thought you were actually in that biz a little bit earlier, so I apologize for that.
Well, actually, it's the theater business. because my theater company is almost 50 years old. Steppenwolf, next year.
Two very, very important anniversaries, but of course the most important one are the people who put on a uniform and put their lives in harm's way to protect all of us and the great freedoms we enjoy here. You've got Joe Montaigne with you as well. Is that right?
Joe and I go way back to the Chicago days. We both grew up in Chicago. And, co-hosting with Joe is just a very special weekend every year. I love doing it. He's a tremendous supporter of our troops. He's an ambassador for the Gary Sinise Foundation, so he's supporting the work that we're doing at the foundation. And he actually got me involved with the National Memorial Day concert back in 2005. I didn't know about the concert, and he told me about it, and I came and played on stage in front of the Capitol with my band in 2005, and then they asked me to co-host the following year with Joe, and I wouldn't miss it.
Now, I want to ask you something. An awful lot of the business you're in is a bit more liberal than perhaps I am. I'm sometimes dismayed by where Hollywood goes, but you do get support from people regardless of their politics, don't you?
Support for the military mission?
Yes.
Yeah, well, I want all Americans to support our military. I don't care who you are. I try to recognize that these men and women are our defenders, our freedom providers. Where would our country be if nobody wanted to serve? We'd be forced to draft everybody into service, and some people just aren't meant for it. So I'm grateful to the men and women who raise their hand and volunteer and go out and serve. And I want all our fellow Americans to recognize that. That's what's great about the National Memorial Day concert, is it's a way for the nation to sort of come together, watching together on television as we celebrate and salute the sacrifices that have been made over the years to keep us free. And each year we have tremendously powerful segments, and we will again this year.
I'm talking to Gary Sinise, and of course, would you mind, Mr. Sinise, remind my listeners where they can help out the Gary Sinise Foundation, because it does take money to make all this happen, and the specific things that the foundation does that people may or may not be aware of.
We're very, very active at the Gary Sinise Foundation. I started the foundation in 2011 after many, many years of supporting multiple nonprofits out there that are helping our veterans and first responders. And so having done that, supporting a lot of different missions, when I started my own foundation, we made a pretty broad mission. So we are in a lot of different spaces. We have a major program that supports our Gold Star families and our Gold Star children. Each year we will take over 1,000 children who have lost a parent in military service to Disney World for 4 or 5 days of just hope and healing, and try to make sure that they know they're appreciated, that we don't forget them. This year we're adding a component to that, where we're also taking first responders, children of fallen first responders, so that we can recognize those sacrifices. We build homes for our wounded. We have entertainment. In fact, on May 26th at Constitution Hall in Washington, D.C., the weekend I'm there for the National Memorial Day concert, we're sponsoring a welcome home celebration for Vietnam veterans. My band will be playing at Constitution Hall. And you can go to GarySiniseFoundation.org, and it's a free concert. There's still some seats available. And you can see the multiple programs that we have at the Gary Sinise Foundation.
Well, in fact, you've got some very special folks who will be in the audience at the concert at Constitution Hall, including some vets who were taken captive as POWs, and including at least one Medal of Honor recipient, if I understand right.
Medal of Honor recipient Sammy Davis will be speaking, as well as one of our POWs, Lee Ellis, will be speaking, kind of representing our POWs. Some POWs will be there. At the National Memorial Day concert, we're featuring 11 on stage, POWs, at the Memorial Day concert. And this is the 50th anniversary of the end of combat operations in Vietnam. So we wanted to recognize that at the National Memorial Day concert, but I also wanted to do something in addition to that. So we're hosting and sponsoring this concert, this free concert at Constitution Hall in celebration of our Vietnam veterans.
Mr. Sinise, thanks very much. I appreciate you doing this for America's vets. It means a lot to all of us, and that while only a tiny percentage of Americans ever have served or are currently serving, we owe them literally our freedoms, and it may even be our lives. We appreciate what you've done for the vets with the foundation you founded more than a decade ago, and I always appreciate it when you take a few minutes with us. Thank you very much, sir.
Thanks, Lars, for having me. I appreciate it.
It is my pleasure. That is Gary Sinise. You know him from the big screen and, of course, from theater, where he started his career about 50 years ago. We'll be back in a moment. You're listening to The Lars Larson Show. Welcome back to The Lars Larson Show. It's a pleasure to be with you and a real pleasure to welcome back to the program Professor Alan Dershowitz, one of America's most accomplished appeals court attorneys on capital cases. He has managed to get 13 wins for clients out of 15 cases. He also taught at Harvard for just short of half a century, and he's written most recently The Price of Principle, Why Integrity is Worth the Consequences. Professor, welcome back.
Well, thank you so much for having me.
You've commented recently, and I wanted to ask you about this, if you can talk about the fact that you said you've read the warrant produced by the FBI and the affidavit that went with it to back it up for the raid on Donald Trump's home just a few weeks ago, and you say that any grand jury in D.C. would be willing to or would find the evidence there to indict President Trump for crimes that were committed. Can you expand on that a bit?
Sure. As the former chief judge in the New York Court of Appeals once said, a prosecutor can get a grand jury to indict a ham sandwich. If it's in the District of Columbia and the person is a Republican, they could get him to indict a tuna sandwich or an egg sandwich. There's a very, very low threshold. Just like Hillary Clinton could easily have been indicted for what she did by a Montana jury or a Mississippi jury. The same thing is true of a D.C. jury. It would be a very easy thing, because it's a low threshold, to indict President Trump just based on the undisputed fact that he has in his possession classified material and material that should go to the archives. It would be a minor offense, but he could be indicted. That's why we need prosecutorial discretion to make sure that people who are about to run for president against the incumbent president aren't selectively prosecuted, which would be the case if he were to be prosecuted.
Professor Dershowitz, do you believe that President Trump's assertions that he declassified all the materials that he took to Mar-a-Lago, should we believe that? And does that matter when it comes to indicting somebody for having classified materials when he was the only person in the country that could unilaterally declassify material?
It's a question of fact and evidence that if he were to be indicted and he raised that defense, if it were a defense, he'd have the burden of demonstrating that he actually did declassify at the time he was president. He could do that through his own testimony. He could do it through the testimony of others. If there was contradictory evidence, a fact finder would have to make that decision. But if he did declassify everything, that would be an absolute defense to any charges relating to the possession of classified material.
Do you believe the FBI was truly seeking evidence of a crime, which is what it takes to get a warrant? You've got to have probable cause to believe that a crime was committed and that evidence of the crime is there. Is that what that raid was really about, or is there another reason the FBI did that?
Well, I don't think that's what the raid was about. They could have gotten all this material by subpoena, or if they thought it was dangerous for him to have that material, they could have sought a search warrant back in February, or they could have executed the warrant the day they got it instead of waiting 2 days. I think the reason they got the search warrant is they didn't want to get into a legal dispute about a subpoena where the judge might have ruled against them, and because a search warrant allows you to search places and areas that you could never get a subpoena for, like Mrs. Trump's closet or perhaps the locked safe. So search warrants are easy to get, too. Judges sign them like parents give out Halloween candy, and very easy to get them. And the Justice Department rules, which Attorney General Garland quoted or that you don't go for a broad search warrant when you could reasonably get the material through less intrusive means like a subpoena. So although there was probable cause laid out in the affidavit, I believe the Justice Department was wrong in seeking a search warrant instead of simply enforcing the subpoena. Remember, they had a subpoena out for these boxes.
Yep.
All they had to do was go to court and say to the judge, we're having trouble with the Trump lawyers. We'd like you to enforce the subpoena, demand that the 15 boxes be brought in, then appoint the special master, have that master go through the boxes and see what's privileged, what's not privileged, what's declassified. And we could do this in a perfectly reasonable legal way. That's the way it should have been done.
Professor, since that's in the news lately and we've been talking about it a lot, does the FBI have any integrity at this point, given all the things that we've heard and read and seen documented about the FBI's activities, especially regarding elections in the last half dozen years?
Well, the FBI itself has great integrity. Its members work very hard. They're great people. When I had a threat on my life once by a neo-Nazi, they came and accompanied me for 2 days. They were the nicest guys in the world. So I wouldn't ever paint with a broad brush. I think there's a problem at the top. I think that there are bad apples. One of them was just forced to resign because he was too political. Others in the past have been pressured to resign. So I think that there's a problem in the FBI, but it doesn't affect individual agents. It really is a systemic problem that has to be dealt with. There has to be some oversight of the FBI, either through the Justice Department or through the courts. But that's true of in a government of checks and balances. That's true of every government agency. Nothing should be beyond checks and balances.
Well, and yet does the Congress do an effective job of oversight when the Congress couldn't get Facebook to admit that it had been apparently directed by the FBI to interfere with an American election, but a podcaster, and a very accomplished one at that, Joe Rogan, did manage to get the head of Facebook, Zuckerberg, to tell him what the Congress couldn't get from him. It doesn't sound like the Congress is very well situated to do the oversight.
Well, Congress did a terrible, terrible job on the January 6th matter. They conducted a kangaroo session where only one side was heard, and the Republicans, at least the Republicans who supported President Trump, didn't even have subpoena power. So you can't expect congressional oversight when you have a one-sided, biased kangaroo committee. That's what the committee was.
I'm talking to Professor Alan Dershowitz, whose latest book is The Price of Principle, Why Integrity is Worth the Consequences. So, Professor, does principle always come with a price?
Well, today it does. Just the story I tell in my book is about what happened largely on Martha's Vineyard in New York and places like that, where I used to be loved by liberals and civil libertarians because I came down often on the side of the Democrats and the left, not because I intended to do that, because those were the people who were being attacked. But when I applied the exact same principles to President Trump, who I voted against twice and who I'm looking forward to voting against the third time, I'm not a Republican. Many of my friends of many years abandoned me. Larry David starts screaming at me, I'm disgusting, because I patted Mike Pompeo on the back. He was my former student, and I was congratulating him for the work he did in the Middle East. The library didn't carry my books. The library didn't allow me to speak. The price of cancellation was very high, particularly for my family. My wife, who didn't even want me to defend President Trump in front of the Senate, has been made into a pariah. She was working out at a gym, and a woman walked in and said, "Oh, my God, that's Alan Dershowitz's wife. I can't be in the same room with her."
I'm talking to Alan Dershowitz, a former Harvard professor for almost 50 years, the author most recently of The Price of Principle, Why Integrity is Worth the Consequences. We'll be back in just a moment. I'll be glad to get your calls in a while. Hey, are you a small business owner, and could you use a few $100,000? Well, employee retention tax credits, they're an incredible opportunity. Call the experts at Get My Funds. They've been around since the beginning of the pandemic, and they've already helped out 1,500 small business owners. And what did they get? $300 million in funding. And they know what they're doing. They have a team of CPAs who specialize in filing for these tax credits. And they're with you every step of the way, even in the event of an audit. They stand behind their work with an audit safeguard. If you retained 5 or more W-2 employees during COVID, and even if you already got the PPP, the Paycheck Protection money, you need to call Get My Funds now. 800-535-2950. And by the way, it's not a grant, it's not a loan, it's a tax refund. No upfront fees to find out if you qualify. Go with a team you can trust at Get My Funds, 800-535-2950 or getmyfunds.com. That's getmyfunds.com. You're listening to The Lars Larson Show. Welcome back to The Lars Larson Show. It's a pleasure to be with you. And my guest is Alan Dershowitz. The professor has given us his time generously over the years. Just as we ended the last segment, you were speaking about the very real human cost, not just to people who take principled stands, but to their family members, to their friends, and everywhere else. And you've said that lawyers are afraid to defend Donald Trump, even if he's right, because they worry that they will be professionally canceled.
Yeah, several of them called me, some of the top lawyers in the country, and said, after what happened to you, we don't want to be Dershowitzed. We don't want to have happen to our family what happened to you. I mean, the stories are just unbelievable. Some people would like to maintain a friendship with us, but they've been warned that if they're seen in public with us, they will be excluded and they will not be allowed to join in events. So one of my oldest friends, who was a former student and who I helped a lot, didn't invite me to a large event. And when I called him and asked him why, he said, it would be social suicide for me to invite you to that event. Nobody would ever invite me to their events. And when people have included my wife and me, they have been in turn excluded and they've lost friends. It's exactly the same as McCarthyism in the 1950s, which I remember well because I was the student government president at Brooklyn College fighting against McCarthyism back then, and I'm fighting against the new McCarthyism now.
So, Professor, how have we gone from an America that just a few years ago there was a popular fictional retelling of a real-life story, Bridge of Spies. Tom Hanks played James Donovan, who was an attorney who did something hugely unpopular at the time. He defended this accused Russian operative. And I'm curious, how do we get from where people like that are lionized to say it's great that he took this principled stand to today's America where you can be canceled for a word or a phrase or defending the wrong person?
Or go back just further in history to John Adams, who defended the people accused of the Boston Massacre, or Abraham Lincoln, who defended guilty people and did it proudly, or Thurgood Marshall. We no longer live in that America. We live in an America of McCarthyism. You know, it's interesting that President Biden misused the term fascism the other day when he accused supporters of Donald Trump of being semi-fascist or near-fascist. I don't like to use the term fascist, but if he was going to use it, he should be using it against the hard left and the Democratic Party as well. Both the hard right and the hard left are totalitarian in their mindset. They are so sure they're right that they can't brook dissent. They don't need due process. Why do you need due process if we know you're guilty? Why do we need free speech if we know what the truth is? That's what's happened in America today, and it's tragic because without free speech, there can be no freedom.
I'm talking to Alan Dershowitz. Professor Dershowitz is the author most recently of The Price of Principle, Why Integrity is Worth the Consequences. Well, then thank God for the founders of the country who'd lived under a tyrannical government and said, all right, we're going to write a Constitution and a Bill of Rights that celebrate the rights of individuals, and we're going to say that they came from God and not from government, because if we don't do that, they're very much at risk. If we didn't have that basis, we'd be in trouble, wouldn't we?
Yeah, and look at what happened recently. A professor at Harvard Law School, a professor at Yale Law School, wrote an op-ed, which the New York Times willingly accepted and published, calling for the trashing of the Constitution, saying, this Constitution is not a particularly good document because it doesn't always produce the right results, the results we on the left want. And, there have been attacks in academia against freedom of speech, against due process. And, I would have thought that being a libertarian or a liberal or a conservative would want you to stick with what's worked for 250 years, and the Constitution has worked. It's not made things easy because it wasn't intended to make things easy, but it avoids tyranny. And yet now today, the greatest danger is tyranny from the left, not the right. Why? The right is the past. They're not running colleges and universities today. The left is the future. The hard, radical, intolerant, totalitarian left is the future because they're the ones that are training our future leaders, our college students, our university students, our law school students. And that's what's so dangerous, why I, as a person of the left, a person who is a civil libertarian and a liberal, have been spending so much of my time attacking the hard left. That's why I wrote my book, The Price of Principle. And the villains of that book are not the conservatives. The villains of that book are the radical leftists, the censorial leftists, the Larry Davids, the Caroline Kennedys, and the others who cannot tolerate differences of opinion.
The professor's book is The Price Principle. So since you mentioned colleges, I have to ask you, we had a president who just recently said, I'm going to give away $500 billion to pay off the debts of people who went to college and got, I have called them bad degrees, meaning a degree that didn't add to your employability or your paycheck enough to be able to pay it back. And he did it with apparently no legal authority at all. I know they're trying to hang it around the HEROES Act, that was not the purpose of the HEROES Act. It was to take care of military, law enforcement, and first responders after the terrorist attack on 9/11. But he does this kind of thing all the time where he'll say, I'm going to have an executive order. And he gets shot down in the courts all the time. How do we rein in a government where Joe Biden could give away $500 billion if he walked over to Capitol Hill and got his friends in the House and the Senate and said, here, pass a bill that says I can give away $500 billion. Otherwise, he doesn't have the authority, and yet he does it. And most of the media is, wow, this is great. The president is giving away money. We never knew he had that power.
Yeah, he doesn't have that power, and I'm involved in consulting with some people trying to bring a lawsuit, not only against him exercising the power to grant relief only to people who haven't paid their debts, not to people who did pay their debts. But we're also mounting a challenge on the Iran deal, which is not a deal. It's a treaty. It looks like a treaty. It quacks like a treaty. It walks like a treaty. And yet the president wants to ram it down the throat of Americans without the two-thirds approval of the Senate, which is required for a treaty. So I think we're seeing a great expansion of executive power at the expense of legislative power. And so we need to use the judiciary to impose that check back on the executive because it's, Congress, the framers of the Constitution intended economic decisions to be made by the House of Representatives to start and then to the Senate. It's in the Constitution, and it ought to be read by Democrats and Republicans alike.
Professor, as you said, you're a man of the left. I'm a conservative. I'm on the right. I'm a conservative first and Republican second. But let me ask you about that treaty, because I agree with you. The Iran deal's a bad deal. It does bad things to the United States' national security and also to the security of our ally Israel. What would happen, and I know Mitch McConnell's been a little skeptical about Republicans taking back control of the Senate. What happens if the Senate just says, he didn't present it as a treaty, but we're going to take it up as a treaty, and then we're going to have a vote, and we're going to vote it down as a treaty? Would that have the effect of negating the Iran treaty?
Nobody knows the answer to that question. The Constitution says the president can make treaties with the approval of two-thirds. So I don't think that the Senate can undo treaties by itself. But I think a court case brought by senators, particularly if you could get more than one-third of them to sign on to a brief, saying we're one-third of the Senate plus, and we don't think that this is just an executive agreement. It's a treaty among multiple countries. I can tell you what George Washington would have thought of this. There's no doubt about that. Just read his second inaugural address. He did not favor entanglements with foreign countries, and that's why the framers made it hard for our government to have treaties.
His latest book is called The Price of Principle. He is Alan Dershowitz, noted appellate court attorney and former Harvard professor. Why Integrity is Worth the Consequences. We'll be back in just a moment. You've got the Lars Larson Show. Welcome back to the Lars Larson Show. We're live on the Stanford campus, but more importantly, we're at the Hoover Institution on War, Revolution, and Peace. And we come here about once a year because we get a chance to talk to some very smart people. And one of them is standing right in front of me. Tyler Goodspeed is an economist. He's the Klein-Heinz Fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford. It's good to have you with us. Step up to that mic just a little closer. We want people to hear you.
It's good to be back. Good to welcome you back.
Well, thank you very much. I read a piece you wrote about Silicon Valley Bank, and I would imagine that's been probably one of the biggest topics for the whole country. But being right here in Silicon Valley, you'd like to find a way to avoid that kind of situation happening again.
Yeah, you would. Unfortunately, I think there probably will be more bank failures, maybe for similar reasons to Silicon Valley Bank. Silicon Valley Bank, they were extending long-term loans. Basically, they were betting on interest rates staying low or going down, and they had a lot of uninsured depositors. And so when those assets got hit, depositors started yanking their money.
Yeah, in fact, that Friday, weren't there about $42 billion in requests to, I want my money out, kind of like the scene in It's a Wonderful Life, only on a massive scale?
Yeah, and the thing with the depositors at Silicon Valley Bank is that a lot of them were tech startups, and so they needed their cash because the tech industry has been hit pretty hard recently, and they were trying to get their cash out to meet payroll costs and to chase higher yields elsewhere. And so it's just kind of a perfect storm. But I think when you have 40-year high inflation and you have the most aggressive Federal Reserve hiking interest rates in 40 years, then there are probably going to be more banks that get caught out.
Okay, but they knew that was happening. In fact, the Fed had, 8 increases last year? Mm-hmm. So if the bank knew it was coming at them, they didn't do anything to prepare?
They didn't do anything to prepare, and it was by all the available evidence, this was a badly run bank. Sometimes you have badly run banks, but I think that can be exacerbated when financial institutions are basically told by regulators that certain assets are safe or even risk-free. And basically that is what banks were told and have been told by U.S. financial regulators, which is U.S. Treasuries are risk-free assets.
Well, they are. You do get your money eventually. It's just that the value of those assets go down when inflation goes up. And none of these folks at a bank noticed what was happening with inflation, or was the problem that they believed Joe Biden when he said, it's transitory. It'll be gone in 5 minutes.
My bet would be they probably believed not only Joe Biden, but Secretary Yellen, the Fed a year and a half ago, who were all still talking the transitory talk.
Do you have now? Were the regulators paying attention?
The regulators noticed that there were issues at Silicon Valley Bank. They were slow to notice and slow to act. And moreover, what's really quite surprising is that if you look back in 2022, when the Fed conducted stress tests on all U.S. banks with more than $100 billion in assets, the adverse stress scenario that they modeled, that they had banks simulate, was a scenario in which interest rates went down.
Went down.
Went down.
So your yields went down, except the value of your treasuries would have gone up.
Would have gone up.
But wasn't Silicon Valley Bank also saying, hey, by the way, we don't need to be subject to those same stress tests. We're different. Weren't they making that argument to the Congress and the regulators?
So what Silicon Valley Bank were saying back in 2018 and other banks were saying is we are not as systemically important as the really, really big banks with
Chase and all those
exactly, guys. With more than $250 billion in assets. But by 2022, or at least the end of 2022, they did have more than $100 billion in assets. And the 2018 law preserved the discretionary authority of the Federal Reserve to conduct enhanced stress testing of financial institutions with over $100 billion. So the Fed could have examined them if they had wanted to.
Okay, let me take you out of economics into politics. how much of the allowances made that allowed this disaster to happen, at least to that bank, and who knows, tip off some other disasters, how much of it happened because they have good friends in politics and in Washington, D.C., and they're doing all the right DEI, ESG nonsense that I think is nonsense. I'd love to hear your opinion on whether ESG actually makes sense or not, but they were doing all these right political things, and so they got excused. Is it too simple to see it that way?
Well, we don't know. It certainly had the impression of that, because here is a bank with a lot of tech depositors, a lot of uninsured tech depositors who are disproportionately friendly with the Democratic Party and with the Biden administration. And as you said, this was a bank that was saying a lot of the right things from the administration's perspective on a lot of their priorities. And so whether or not it was saved because they were doing and saying the things that the Biden administration liked, whether they were saved because there were uninsured tech startup depositors, it created that impression. And I think that's why we've seen a lot of unease in the past 2 weeks, is because now there's this question mark. Is a small regional bank that isn't politically connected, are your deposits there as safe as if your deposits are with Chase or Bank of America or Citi or with a politically connected bank?
Now, you mentioned a couple of times they were uninsured, except Joe Biden snapped his fingers and said, no, all of a sudden you are insured. 93% of their deposits were uninsured, $156 billion, and the president just waves a magic wand and says, no, it turns out you're covered after all. You're going to get all your money from everybody else at every other bank in America, right?
They did say that for SVB, that we're going to make sure that not only are the insured depositors made whole, but the uninsured depositors won't lose any money either. And then a day or two later, Secretary Yellen comes out and says, "Oh no, but this is not going to be a general rule."
I keep wondering if a bank in Houston, maybe one that does a lot of oil business, might say, "Oh no, you folks aren't insured. It's only our friends in Silicon Valley." Is there any way to escape that impression from the government, saying it depends on who your friends are?
I think that it's hard to escape that once you've generated that impression, but I think they have to make clear that they are going to consistently and fairly handle any future SVB-type failures.
I'm talking to Tyler Goodspeed. He's, of course, a fellow here at the Hoover Institution. So is there anything we should do going forward to try to say to these banks, if you've got problems like this, you need to start deleveraging and getting them dealt with right now. And if you have to have a come to Jesus with the Fed and say, look, we got problems, we'll start doing it now. The problem is the minute they start, if Silicon Valley Bank had said a year ago, hey, we better start getting rid of some of these assets that have dropped in value, they might have had the run sooner.
You raise a good point, and that is, in many ways, this does create a bit of moral hazard, what economists call moral hazard, in that if I'm another bank looking at what happened, the treatment of SVB, I might come to the conclusion, well, I'm not doing so well now. I've incurred some losses because I made the wrong bets on interest rates. I'm actually going to maybe double down now, try to win back, make good my losses.
Tyler Goodspeed, thank you very much.
Good to be with you.
And you're listening to The Lars Larson Show. Welcome back to The Lars Larson Show. It's a pleasure to be with you. And as we do almost every year, we're taking a week at Stanford University. But not at Stanford specifically, but at the Hoover Institution for War, Revolution, and Peace, which is a little conservative island in the middle of a fairly big blue campus that is full of liberals. The thing is, though, it's not all liberals at Stanford, because there is the Stanford Review, and we've always looked forward to the opportunity to talk to somebody who's on the Stanford campus going to school who actually believes in conservative principles. Not that I wouldn't talk to the liberals as well, they just don't want to talk to me. But we've never had that opportunity before, and now I get the opportunity who's from somebody who's actually from my neck of the woods, and that's Josiah Joner. Josiah, welcome to the program.
Absolutely, Lars. Thanks so much for having me. It's great to be on.
Hey, listen, we're going to at some point talk about the fact that you're headed off to testify to the United States Congress, but let's get to that in just a moment, and to the fact that you've written recently about enrollment issues that have to do with race-based decision-making by colleges and universities when it comes to who goes to school, even at elite places like Stanford where you're a student. But let's start first with what happened in the last couple of weeks here on the campus. I wasn't here when it did, but a federal judge was invited to speak on campus. He shows up on campus. There was, of course, because he's a conservative federal judge, there were a number of students who objected to him even being there, to him even opening up his mouth and expressing his opinion. But what was even more stunning was a member of the Stanford University staff, the diversity director, actually objected to him voicing his opinion. Is this the way things always go down here on the campus you attend?
Well, I will say, Lars, it's not like this in the classroom every day, which is good, and this is not, a usual event. But the issue is, Lars, that these issues, when we have administrators and deans like Dean Steinbeck at Stanford, who actively encourage these protests and condone this assault on free speech, is that it ruins our classroom. And it ruins the rest of Stanford. And students, both conservatives and liberals, are too scared now to speak up because they know if they, just for sharing their viewpoint or stating their ideas, they might be condemned by these same deans and administrators. And so what it's really done is destroyed the humanities and destroyed this free discussion in the classrooms and just killed off the debates that students can have. And it's exiled it to outside groups like the Stanford Review, where we actually can promote, free discussion and free ideas. And in those groups and those discussions, you're getting higher level academic debates because people can debate freely, and you're not getting it in the classroom. So that's the biggest fallout from this, is that it's destroying what people can and can't say and feel comfortable saying in the classroom, which is exactly the purpose of these universities.
I'm talking to Josiah Joner, who's a student at Stanford University, and that's a subject we could talk about for hours, because when I first went to college, and that was a long time ago, and I never finished, like you're going to finish here at Stanford, the idea was, you're going to come here and you're going to get exposed to all these different ideas. You're telling me the idea of being exposed to a lot of different ideas has just kind of gone by the wayside.
Yes, absolutely. It's we see these examples. All students see these examples of these deans, shouting down this federal judge for just stating his viewpoints, and then when they get to the classroom and are in a room with people who are going to disagree with them, they're not going to feel comfortable sharing their opinions, and it's destroyed these classes, Lars, and it's really unfortunate. But these classes I've been in that are supposed to be promoting these ideas, these free exchange of ideas, and these debates, just feel empty and dry because people are too scared just to share their opinions. They know that, some dean might come after them for sharing it. And so it's like I said, it's exiled these debates to these other groups and few remaining groups who are still willing to discuss ideas openly. And it's taken it out from the university itself, which is extremely unfortunate.
I'm talking to Josiah Joner. He also writes for the Stanford Review, as well as being a student here at Stanford University in Northern California. I want to save some time to talk about your testimony to Congress, but you wrote at the Review, Stanford's enrollment rate for white students in the class of 2026 was 22%, a drop from 40% in the class of 2016. Of course, white Americans are about 65% of the population. Is this the idea of diversity, that white students are actually now a decided minority on a college campus, not represented as they would be in the rest of the population, but actually not really allowed to come to school here?
Well, it's quite unfortunate, Lars, and I went back through the data and worked with some of my professors on this, and went back through about a decade of Stanford's publicly posted common data sets. But I think I was the first one to put it together, and what it seems like is there's been an approximately 15% drop in white enrollment rate and a 10% increase in Asian enrollment rate, and all other racial groups have just remained constant, which does not point to a pretty picture. What it really seems to point to is the systematic racial engineering that Stanford is using, and either they're compensating for former Asian discrimination and now currently discriminating against white students, or they're using racial quotas, which are also strictly illegal, and Stanford claims to not be using them. So whatever the data points to, it doesn't point to a pretty picture, and it's quite unfortunate.
Well, and Is that part of what you're going to be testifying to the Congress about? I mean, as a college student, this got to be a thrill to get invited to talk to the Congress. Is that what they came ask you to come back and talk about?
They asked me actually to talk about free speech, so there'll be a hearing on free speech, and so I'll be covering more of the stuff that happened at the Stanford Law School just a few weeks ago.
All right, let's go back to enrollment then. As you point out, it's not legal for anybody. For me as an employer of 3 people, I couldn't legally go out, even if you said you're doing it for the best reasons, Lars. I couldn't say, well, my next producer will be a woman or will be somebody who's black or will be somebody who's gay. That's illegal. How is it that these universities, even private institutions, are getting away with what appears to be pretty blatant discrimination?
Yeah, Lars, I don't know. I mean, we're seeing the case play out right now with Harvard and UNC at the Supreme Court in a decision that should come out soon. But what's also unfortunate and quite crazy is that Stanford sent out all to the student body a long email and the 70-page report talking about past Jewish discrimination in the 1950s. And they apologized for this and talked about how they were moving to fix and this past discrimination and make it better. But now, and back then it was this idea that there were almost these racial quotas for Jewish students. They said, well, we couldn't technically find any proof of racial quotas, but there was clear discrimination at the highest levels of the university.
This is Josiah Joner. It's a real pleasure to talk to you, Josiah. Josiah is a student at Stanford University, writes at the Stanford Review. We're going to post a link to the piece he wrote entitled Stanford's Racial Engineering. And, of course, he's testifying to the U.S. Congress. Josiah, congratulations on that. Glad to hear you're speaking out for First Amendment rights and free speech. I really appreciate your time.
Thanks for having me, Lars. I really appreciate it.
We're live on the Stanford University campus at the Hoover Institution, and we'll be back in just a moment. We'll get to your phone calls and emails at 866-HEY-LARS. That's 866-439-5277. Send your emails to talk@larslarson.com, and you're listening to The Lars Larson Show. Welcome back to The Lars Larson Show. It's a pleasure to be with you. And, of course, national security is one of the biggest concerns we have on this program. And I get the chance when we're broadcasting from the Hoover Studios on the Stanford campus at the Hoover Institution on War, Revolution, and Peace to get a chance to talk to some of the smartest people around. Now, unfortunately, I'm not face-to-face with Professor Peter Berkowitz, who is the Tad and Diane Taub Senior Fellow at the Hoover Institution. He's, in fact, in my second favorite place on earth, and that would be Israel. Professor, it's good to have you back on the program, though.
It's good to be with you. Thank you.
Absolutely. So let's launch right into some national security issues, because I want to start with one that's brand new, and that's where President Biden has issued apparently an executive order that seeks to protect the country and its government institutions from spyware. And while the order apparently doesn't list which spyware is covered, apparently those in the know, including I would imagine you, would say that the Pegasus spyware from an Israeli company is one of the ones that's the focus of this order. Can you share with us what you know?
The truth is I don't have much details about that specific spyware, that particular form, but I can tell you, as you know, that Israel is one of the great, today, high-tech hubs in the world that over the last, I would say especially over the last 3 years, and this is partly as a result of conversations with the Trump administration State Department, in which I served. In general, the Israelis have become much more alert to the dangers of spyware, especially spyware coming from under the supervision of the Chinese Communist Party. And I think there's an increasing community of interest between the United States and Israel in avoiding the use of such dangerous spyware and developing alternatives to it, developing defenses against the threats of cyber warfare.
Professor, do you think we're getting better at that protection? Because it seems, though, that the technology is racing along at a speed that government has a difficult time keeping up with.
Look, there's no doubt that we are getting better at it, but the problem is, as your question suggests, and this happens in other spheres as well, that even as our defenses are improved, offensive capabilities improve at the same time. And what we really need to underscore is how significant the dangers are. I can remember hearing a lecture from a U.S. U.S. Navy admiral from more than a decade ago, stating that the Chinese have the ability to fry our electric systems, to close down aviation, to end our ability to make banking transactions through the use of spyware, through their cyber offenses. So the question was raised: what prevents them from doing that? And the answer was their knowledge that the United States possesses the capabilities to open dams in China and to fry their computer networks. In other words, and I don't think this is sufficiently appreciated in the United States, we are living actually in a world today, the kind of mutually assured destruction, governed by a doctrine of mutually assured destruction, not only in regard to the use of nuclear weapons, but in regard to the use of cyber weapons.
And those could be used much more readily, couldn't they? Because in some ways you could use them discreetly. You could, if you were a country, if the United States said, we want to retaliate against something China's done, we could say, open up one of their dams, as you said. And we could do that without many fingerprints being left on that. Only we and the Chinese might know that we were the ones who did it. And the same could work in reverse, couldn't it?
I think that's right, and there's another dimension of it, which in a way is less subtle than the point you're making. The development of nuclear weapons requires massive infrastructure, and it involves missiles, and it involves centrifuges that can enrich uranium, whereas cyber weapons can require a handful of very, very smart people sitting in front of computer terminals and figuring stuff out. So it's not only that it's less traceable, as you suggest, fewer fingerprints, it's that the financial investment is drastically less. In the good old days of nuclear warfare, you had to be a state to have the wealth, the wherewithal to produce nuclear weapons. You do not have to be a state to produce fearsome cyber weapons today. And if I may add this, there are no two countries in the world that are more dependent on their computer networks, their digital capabilities than the United States and Israel. That makes us very vulnerable to attacks.
Do you think that we're doing the things we need to do to properly protect those things? I think of perhaps one small example. If they can open a dam, they can turn off a power grid or part of a power grid. And you would think that, well, then the solution to that is air gap some of that stuff so the really important things in our society are protected, from intrusion if you don't have a gateway into that network because it's running a dam or running a power plant or running part of the power grid. And yet the temptation is everybody wants to have everything linked so it becomes easier to operate. Do we need to start taking some of those measures and air gapping things so that we can say we know the power grid is safe, we know the water supply is safe from outside intrusion? And have we done that?
An old-fashioned teaching from the United States military is the importance of redundancy. You need a capability, and when that capability breaks down or wears out or is attacked, you need to be able to supply that capability in some other way. Are we good enough right now in defending ourselves, or if elements of our computer security are attacked, our internet system attacked, of replacing them? Absolutely not. However, is the military, is the State Department, or other parts of the American government, are they aware of this problem, and have they begun over the last 5 to 10 years to take steps? Yes, and you'll be able to talk to my colleagues at the Hoover Institution who are paying very close attention and actually, I believe, working with the government to help it become better equipped to take on the variety of vulnerabilities that we face. But yes, I certainly regard this as an urgent matter of American national security to upgrade the defenses of our computer systems on which we so greatly rely.
Professor Peter Berkowitz is visiting with me. We're going to continue this conversation in just a moment. He is the Tad and Diane Taub Senior Fellow at the Hoover Institution, where we're broadcasting live this week on the campus of Stanford University. And yes, I've had my friends say, Lars, Stanford's very, very liberal. And I said, yes, and Hoover is comfortably conservative. We're going to continue this in just a moment. And I want to talk to Professor Berkowitz about TikTok. I want to talk to him about a number of other issues, including what's going on in Israel right now. As you know, I've done the show 5 different times from Israel over the last 20 years. I love that country, only second to my own, and I want to make sure that they stay safe, and I think that keeping Israel safe is a part of keeping the United States safe. And I'm not sure the Biden administration is doing that. We'll be back to continue this discussion in just a moment. Then we'll get to your phone calls and emails in a bit at 866-HEY-LARS. That's 866-439-5277. As always, naysayers go to the head of the line. If you'd rather email, it's talk@LarsLarson.com. And you can vote in our Twitter poll at Lars Larson Show on Twitter and LarsLarson.com on the web. We'll be right back. We're live at Stanford University, and you're listening to The Lars Larson Show. Welcome back to the Lars Larson Show. It's a pleasure to be with you. We're broadcasting, as we do almost every year, from the Hoover Institution at Stanford University for this week. And even though Professor Peter Berkowitz is in Israel right now, rather than being here, where he serves as the Tad and Diane Taub Senior Fellow at Hoover Institution, it's a pleasure to talk to you, even though we're on the phone and we're on opposite ends of the clock, on opposite sides of the planet. Professor Berkowitz, tell us why are you in Israel right now? What are you working on?
Well, I was particularly prompted to make this visit to Israel because of the what has been an unfolding crisis in the country over proposals by the current government to substantially reform the judicial system, and that the protests have been sweeping the country for about 3 months now, and as we've seen more and more internal disarray, the security issues have also become more urgent. It was just reported that the Pentagon has declared that the Islamic Republic of Iran is now not more than a few months away from assembling a nuclear weapon. Israel's enemies in southern Lebanon, Hezbollah, which has massive arsenal of rockets and missiles, is looking with glee as Israel's struggling with this controversy over reform of the judiciary. So as I often am, I'm worried that we in the United States do not understand the complexities of what's taking place in this remarkable country, Israel. So I came here to understand better and report on it.
Well, I want to ask you about this. When we talk about reforming the judiciary, I get the impression, Professor, that the American news media has been mischaracterizing this, because the characterization that I've gathered from reading, and I try to read both the left and the right, I read the mainstream media and others, is, well, Netanyahu would like to have the power to supersede or overturn decisions made by the court. And when I first heard that, Professor, maybe I'm misunderstanding what he's proposing, but we have the same capability here in this sense. There was a time when the U.S. Supreme Court said on a particular case, you are carrying out the death penalty. This is what the court decided, and you're doing it unconstitutionally. Yes. And the response to it, which was a proper one, was states said, if you've decided the way we were doing it was unconstitutional, you don't just stop using the death penalty. You say, we will then go back and rewrite the death penalty law through legislative process or in Congress, depending on where the proper venue is, and then we'll do the death penalty. That's not overturning the courts. It's not superseding the courts. It's taking note. The courts have pointed out you've done this in an unconstitutional way, and the legislators, whether they're local or national, say, okay, we'll figure out a way to do it constitutionally. That's not overturning anything, is it?
Well, you're right. That is that in the United States, after a ruling by the Supreme Court that goes against the government, two kinds of things can happen. If it's a matter of a simple law and the court says this formulation or that formulation doesn't pass constitutional muster, Congress can go back and rewrite the statute in a way that will pass constitutional muster. Or there is a way, actually it's written into the Constitution for overcoming a decision of the Supreme Court. It's called amending the Constitution. Yeah. If you really don't like a ruling of the Supreme Court, then when 2/3 of both houses of Congress propose a change and 3/4 of the states ratify it, you've got a new constitutional view, and the Supreme Court has to then make rulings consistent with the amendment. So you're right that in that respect, proposals in Israel do not go against the spirit of the American Constitution. That said, there were some problems with the original legislation proposed by the Netanyahu government. They had their version of they called it in the Hebrew Piskata Hitkabrut, the overcoming clause, would be based on a simple majority of 61 out of a Knesset, a parliament of 120. So some critics said you just can't do that. They were wrong because for the reasons you've already mentioned, but it would be more reasonable and might even be able to attract a majority in the country beyond Netanyahu's coalition to say, look, in order to maintain a kind of balance between the branches here in Israel, the Knesset has to have the power in exceptional cases to overturn decisions of the Supreme Court. Let's allow them to do that with, who knows, 65 or 67 or 68 votes out of 120. But I do want to underscore the point you made. Having some kind of legislative override of a Supreme Court is not a departure from the basic principles of separation of powers and liberal democracy.
Yeah, that's all. And is that what Netanyahu is seeking, to be able to go in and actually override the courts, or simply say the courts say that we're doing it the wrong way, we'll do it the right way? Because if we went all the way back to, say, Miranda, there was a time when the courts decided the way that American police are arresting people without advising them of their rights violates the Constitution. You didn't have every police agency in America say, well, then we'll just stop arresting people. They said, no, we'll keep arresting people, but we will amend our process, our procedure to advise people of their rights, and then our arrests will be constitutional. It was a perfectly acceptable fix. It did get legislation, but it didn't actually have to have legislation. If every police department in America just said, fine, we'll start advising people of their constitutional rights, and then we will satisfy Miranda. Is that what Netanyahu is seeking, or is he seeking something more than that I'm not understanding?
Well, he has been seeking, his government actually has been seeking a more significant change to the judicial system. And of course, we have to emphasize that he's doing so in the face of a genuine provocation. Israel is home to what is probably the single most activist Supreme Court in the Western world. Its Supreme Court has a view that has a doctrine of standing, that is, who can bring a case, which says that you don't have to be directly injured by some law or governmental action. If you disagree with it, exactly. You can bring a challenge to the you understand immediately what the problem is. As you know, in the United Sorry, exactly. Yeah, in the United States, as you know, Article 3 of the Constitution says only cases and controversies come before the Supreme Court. And what kind of cases, controversies? If you or I am, directly hurt by a law, we lose money, we lose our property, we lose the right of freedom of speech, we can bring a case. But if I live in California and something bad happens to a person in Florida, no matter how greatly I sympathize with that person, if I'm not directly injured, I can't sue. Anyway, in Israel, you can. Israel also has a very broad understanding of Knesset laws and more. So it's important for the Supreme Court to be independent. It's important for the Supreme Court when necessary, to strike down laws that depart clearly and aggressively from the written laws within Israel. But the Supreme Court over the last 30 years has arrogated itself these wide, expansive powers, and the Netanyahu government reasonably says this is too much of an interference with the will of the people. Now, I do think that some of the proposals of the Netanyahu government go too much in the opposite direction. In other words,
Professor Berkowitz is with me. He is the Tad and Diane Taub Senior Fellow at the Hoover Institution. We're broadcasting live from Hoover on the Stanford University campus. We'll be back in just a moment. You're listening to The Lars Larson Show. Welcome back to the Lars Larson Show. It's a pleasure to be with you, and it's always a pleasure on our annual visit down to the Hoover Institution at Stanford University to get a chance to talk to some of their top minds. And one of them is Peter Berkowitz, who is the Tad and Diane Taub Senior Fellow at the Hoover Institution. He happens to be in Israel right now, which is kind of convenient because, Professor, I appreciate all the time. Let me ask you about this. Iran, I think, is a threat to the United States, and they regularly remind us of this by saying we're going to go after the Saturday people, that's the Jews and Israel, and we're going to go after the Sunday people, which is, the predominant population of the United States. And they do this all the time, and they are now, as you mentioned a moment ago, months away perhaps from achieving a nuclear weapon. They're also doing some deals with both Russia and perhaps China as well that make me a bit uneasy. And at the same time, it seems as though the Biden administration is not really working in concert with its ally Israel to try to push back on this, and there have been some other developments as well. I take it this concerns you.
It concerns me greatly, and it has concerned Israeli governments, and not only the current Netanyahu government, but the government that was in place last summer, led by Naftali Bennett and Yair Lapid. In fact, as late as late August of 2022, the Israelis were afraid that the Biden administration was going to enter into JCPOA 2, the second Iran deal with the mullahs of Iran concerning their nuclear program. And the Israelis viewed this possibility roughly the same way they viewed the first America-led Iran deal, which was providing Iran a glide path to the acquisition of a nuclear weapon. So that initiative by the Biden administration seems to have fallen by the wayside. But still, I don't think we see a tough enough approach toward the Islamic Republic of Iran coming from the Biden administration. By the way, this is in contrast to what you saw in the Trump administration, especially from the Pompeo State Department, in which I served, where Secretary Pompeo led what he called a maximum pressure campaign, that is, impose sanctions on the Iranian regime that were as tough as possible, with the purpose of ultimately bringing them back to the negotiating table so that America could strike a deal with the Iranians that was actually genuinely in America's interest and in the interest of America's friends in the Middle East.
Why is the Biden administration, number one, I want you to address this for a moment as well, and that is, why did the Biden administration walk away from what seemed to be momentum behind the Abraham Accords to actually get some countries in that region to start getting together with Israel and being willing to work together on things, which would have been a counterbalance to Iran? The Biden administration isn't pursuing that anymore and doesn't appear to want to try to hold Iran back from getting a nuclear weapon. Do you have any insight as to why they're saying this is not important to America and the rest of the world?
I have no great insight. I can tell you, though, I can offer this from the outside, that it certainly seemed, having left the State Department on the day before Joe Biden's inauguration, and having watched for almost a year and seen the Biden State Department seemingly embarrassed to even speak of the Abraham Accords, it certainly seemed like they were they were embarrassed that the Trump administration, with its supposed amateurs, had achieved something that none of the previous administrations had achieved, and certainly not the 8 years of the Obama administration, which was a decisive breakthrough in the Middle East, in which Israel immediately doubled the number of Arab countries and with which it had normal relations, from just Egypt and Jordan to also Bahrain and the United Arab Emirates. And by the way, it seems like that would not have been possible if the Saudis had not at least given a yellow light, if not a green light, to the Bahrainis and the Emiratis. So a certain embarrassment, maybe a certain jealousy, it's hard to say. But what we can report is what you yourself have already stated, that very little seemed to have been done in that first year to take advantage. Instead, the Biden administration returned to the policies of the Obama administration in the face of stronger relations between America's friends in the region, Bahrain, United Arab Emirates, Israel, and increasingly Saudi Arabia. The Biden administration sought to double down on a deal with the Iranians. Now, the Emiratis, the Bahrainis, and the Israelis rightly view the Iranians as hostile parties. So this sent a bad message to the Gulf. It did not send a good message to Israel. And by the way, what have we just witnessed in the last few months? We have witnessed Saudi Arabia striking Saudi Arabia and Iran resuming relations in a process that was brokered by the Chinese Communist Party. We have just we have helped bring back the Chinese. We have ushered the Chinese Communist Party into the Middle East by estranging our Saudi friends. I think this is a huge mistake.
I think it is too, and this is the part that when you say that Trump came into an environment in which his team was described as amateurs, they were not, that they couldn't achieve anything. You also had people like John Kerry, who literally described any Middle East peace deals could not be done without the involvement and, I guess, the sign-off of the Palestinians. And yet Trump did exactly that. He invited them to be at the party. They said, we don't want to be there. He said, fine, we'll go on without you. And they had a successful set of deals that were cut. And what disappoints me as an American is we were well on our path to, 3 or 4 more deals if the Biden administration had continued that. And that was just tossed. Or am I wrong in assessing it that way?
No. And if I may, I would like to amplify your point about former Secretary Kerry. You can still find this online. In an interview that he gave at the Brookings Institution, I believe in spring of 2016, he was asked point blank whether it might be possible for Israel to strike deals with Gulf Arab states without first having signed a peace deal with the Palestinians. And a pleasure speaking with you. Thank you very much.
We'll be back in just a moment. Your calls are welcome at 866-HEY-LARS. Naysayers to the head of the line at 866-439-5277. Send your emails to talk@larslarson.com. Live from the Hoover Institution broadcast studios on the Stanford campus, you're listening to The Lars Larson Show.